Welcome back to MetFlex and Chill. This is Rachel Gregory, your host, and today is Friday, which means that it's Q&A day, favorite day of the week. Well, one of my favorite days of the week. Anyway, before we jump into the questions for today, I do want to remind you or let you know if you haven't heard already, I actually changed my website recently and actually my entire business name recently. So my website is now metflexlife.com or www.metflexlife.com. And I will link that in the show notes. But from now on, if you want to access anything related to my content, recipes, any of the podcast show notes, any of my exercise or nutrition programs, or if you want to apply for one-on-one coaching, just go to my website, metflexlife.com, and everything is on there. Also, there's tons of blog posts and videos and lots of free information and free educational content. So definitely check it out if you haven't already. Again, I'll link it in the show notes, but you can just go to metflexlife.com. All right, let's get into the question for today. And before we get into the questions, one more quick thing. If you're enjoying this show, as always, please make sure to take a screenshot of the episode as you're listening to it. Post it to your Instagram story if you have an Instagram, and you can tag me at rachelgregory.cns. That will help spread the word about the show, get more people interested, and really help out. So I would love it if you could do that. All right, let's get into the questions now. Okay, first question today. I know I'm not hungry, but I have the wanting to eat food. What is the reasoning for this? Okay, this is a great question because I know that I have suffered from this many, many times, and I know a lot of us struggle with this. Kind of this concept of emotional eating or what do people call it? Like mindlessly eating or snacking. It's something that I think a lot of people deal with, and really the biggest or the first thing to understand is that it all does start in our brain, right? And so there's a book that I read about 6 months ago. It's called The Hungry Brain by Stephan Guyenet. I actually have it here with me because I do want to read a few excerpts from the book just because this book is literally all about our brain and the signals that go on and kind of our conscious versus non-conscious brain and how this can affect how much we eat, when we eat, our cravings, things like that. And so I'm going to read a few excerpts, that's a hard word to say, like I said, from the book, but I highly encourage you, if you are someone who struggles with like mindless eating or emotional eating, this is a really good book. There's so many light bulb moments that went off for me while reading this book. And I'm actually trying to get Stephan on the podcast soon. So stay tuned for that. Hopefully I can get him on and, I can ask him all the questions that I have related to his book. But again, it's called The Hungry Brain. I'll link it in the show notes. But he does mention, and this is kind of in the first few pages of the book, he talks about our conscious versus non-conscious brain. So I'm going to read a quick paragraph. He says, the conflict between the conscious and non-conscious brain explains why we overeat even though we don't want to. Although we try to control our behavior using the conscious parts of our brains, the non-conscious parts work to undermine our good intentions. So really, this is kind of just thinking back to, he talks about thinking back to like, how our brains developed over time, right? And how the times that our ancestors lived in versus the times that we live in now. They're very different times, but they're not, very long ago, right? So like only a few hundred years ago in the grand scheme of things is not a long time. But he kind of talks about this. There's another excerpt. Geez, I can't say that word that I want to read. And he talks about kind of these impulses that we get through our brain and how these impulses function. They function and they evolve to help us survive, thrive, and reproduce in the ancient world, but they no longer exist today. So he says the same impulses that get us into trouble today were extremely useful for our forebears. Wow. struggling today. So our ancestors. He said, while a calorie-seeking brain is an asset when calories are hard to come by, it's a liability when we're drowning in food. Scientists call this an evolutionary mismatch. In other words, a situation in which once useful traits become harmful once they dragged into an unfamiliar environment. Many researchers believe that the evolutionary mismatches explain a number of the chronic disorders that are so common in the affluent world. In this book, I'll argue that overeating and obesity are caused by a mismatch between ancient survival circuits in the brain and an environment that sends these circuits the wrong messages. So really what he's saying, and really a lot of the things he dives into in the book, are obviously related to the brain, but also related to the environment we live in now versus where, the environment our ancestors lived in. So they were hunter-gatherers, there was food scarcity, they had to go out and seek food. So the signals that they got through their brain, like that was helping them to go out and hunt and gather and things like that in a time of scarcity, usually. Whereas now we have food literally everywhere. I talked about this before, but we have Uber Eats and probably McDonald's on every corner, grocery store on every corner. Like there's so much food around us that we are never in scarcity, right? We never have, we're never, unless you're camping or, out in the wild or something like that. But like in America today, there's no scarcity, right? So anyway, with that being said, it's kind of just this idea of like setting your environment to work for you rather than against you. So when I say that, I mean, if, for example, in your house or in your kitchen, if you have a ton of super hyper palatable foods around, that's going to trigger you probably to want to eat more or eat mindlessly, because a lot of those foods are manufactured to turn these circuits on in your brain that basically, it's basically that non-conscious brain, and to encourage you to eat more, right? These processed hyperpalatable foods, they turn that switch on, right? And so there is kind of this, there's some people who say, you can have those in moderation, or, you can keep them around and just practice moderation. But for some of us, that's a lot harder in terms of like keeping these things around in your house, say like ice cream and cookies and things like that. Like if they're there, it's a lot harder to kind of abstain from them versus if you one weekend or a Friday night you want ice cream, right? Go out and get ice cream, but don't keep the ice cream in your house if you know that it's something that triggers you, right? So there are some people who can work towards, more moderation and can have, it's like this concept of moderators versus abstainers. There's some people who are moderators and they can have these foods around in their house and they can, quote unquote, moderate them and have them in small amounts and not be tempted to eat the entire carton of ice cream or cookies or whatever it is. And there's other people who just can't do that, right? And it's just, it's figuring out like who you are and really like how you can work towards setting your environment up to, again, work for you rather than against you. And he also talks about this concept of, I just lost my train of thought and I keep saying, I apologize. He talks about this concept of the dopamine effect, right? And the chemistry of the seducing foods that we have in our current society, right? So all these hyperpalatable foods that are literally manufactured to turn those triggers on in our brain to want us to continue to eat more and more and more. He says that although it's controversial to call these foods addictive, it is fair to say that they provoke dopamine release in the ventral striatum, which is just a part of the brain. And the more concentrated they are, the more dopamine they release. The more dopamine they release, the more they reinforce behavior. And the more they reinforce behavior, the closer they bring us to addiction. So this is not just with sugar. Sugar is definitely does definitely create a dopamine release in our brain, but also, like I said, all of these processed hyperpalatable foods that are filled with a lot of sugar and bad fats too. So, it's just coming back to this realization and this awareness piece of it. And, I think personally that if you can set your environment up, i.e. your house, your kitchen, your pantry, all of that to work in your favor versus to tempt you late at night when you know you suffer from nighttime snacking or mindless eating. You know, if you have like the ice cream in the freezer or the cookies in the cabinet, like those are going to trigger you. Just get it out of the house. And if you live with people who want that stuff in the house, then I think that's time to have a conversation and say, okay, you know, this, either you hide them from me or you put them out of sight, out of mind, or whatever it is. It's getting to a place that you can feel comfortable in this environment and set yourself up for success, because that is the biggest thing. And I think even with like the healthier, more, you know, even healthy packaged food or quote unquote healthy packaged foods, like even if they're low carb protein bars or low carb ice cream or cookies or whatever, it's still hyper palatable food, right? So if most of your food is focused more around whole foods, right? I always say this, like if it one had a face at some point or two had grown from the earth at some point, those are the foods that you want to have throughout your day that are like 80 to 90% of your day should incorporate those foods. And then maybe like 10 to 15% can be some more of those processed foods. But if you know you're someone who struggles with moderating those processed foods and they're turning into like 50% of your day, then that's where you need to kind of figure out a balance there, right? So anyway, now I'm just getting a little bit more off topic, but hopefully that gives you a little insight. And I think this also has to do with this concept of emotional eating. And emotional eating is typically defined as eating, usually overeating in response to a feeling or an emotion. And it can either be a negative emotion or a positive emotion. A lot of people associate emotional eating with negative emotions. So like stress from work or stress at home with your family or whatever type of stress it is, but it can also be associated with positive emotions. So if you think of like celebrations or birthday parties, you always have cake. That would be a positive emotional eating stimulus, I guess you could say. So with emotional eating, it's really something that can actually turn into a habit, right? Or it can turn habitual. So again, that mindless snacking at night, or, you know, the mindless snacking during the day if you're stressed at work, that can be triggered by stress or emotions, but it can turn into a habit. And if you're experiencing, you know, stress and other emotions, and it's on a daily basis, and it's turning into where you're using food to cope with that, that can turn into a habit. And then your very first impulse whenever you have one of these emotional episodes, whether it's stress or whatever it is, your very first impulse is to reach for food because it's become a habit, right? And it can become so automatic that it's really difficult to distinguish between the emotional hunger and like true physiological hunger. So I actually wrote a blog post all about emotional eating and kind of give you some step-by-step guidance to work through it, and then also give you some strategies and tools and tips and tricks to help you get past it. So I'm going to link that blog post in the show notes. The biggest thing here to realize, though, is awareness is the first step. So finding ways to create awareness around your behaviors is the biggest and the most important thing you can do, because that will help you to start to learn how to work towards changing, and adapting these behaviors and creating better habits that work for you rather than against you, really. And setting yourself up, especially within your environment, for success, rather than trying to fight the current environment that you're in, if that makes sense. So anyway, I talk all about this in that blog post, so definitely check out, the blog post is called "And Then I Ate My Feelings." So if you go to my website, MetFlexLife.com, you click the blog tab and go to the search feature, you can just type in either emotional eating, or you can type in "And Then I Ate My Feelings," and the blog post should come up with a bunch of strategies, tools, some cheat sheets, stuff like that. So again, I'll link it in the show notes. Hopefully that addressed your question a little bit, but I would recommend getting the book, The Hungry Brain by Stephan Guyenet. I will link that again in the show notes, and read through that. You'll have a lot of light bulb moments, and he also gives some strategies, tips and tricks and stuff like that to think about as well. So anyway, sorry, I just rambled on with that question, but hopefully that made sense and somewhat answered your question. Next question, do you ever do full body workouts or only focus on specific muscle groups a day? Okay, this is a good question. So before I jump into the different splits, I will say that when I'm programming for clients or even getting a program from my coach for myself, the first thing that we think about is how many days per week can you train realistically and in the long term, right? So it doesn't matter how good your programming is if you can't stick to it. It doesn't matter how quote unquote ideal it is if you can't stick to it. So the first thing is to solidify how many days per week you can train. And then from there, we can set up your program or your split to be incorporated into those days, because it's going to change depending on how many days you can work out, whether you're doing, a full body split, upper lower split, things like that. So that's kind of how I think about it. And then also we want to realize that there are three main variables that actually build the foundation of your training program. So I want to talk through these really quickly, just so we're all on the same page. So the first one is volume. So that's like the total amount of work that's performed. The second one is intensity. So this can be the intensity of the load that you're lifting or the intensity of effort. So intensity of load is basically how much you're lifting, and it's usually defined as related to your 1 rep max or a percentage of that. And then the intensity of effort is basically how near to your max effort the load is that you're lifting, right? So with my online clients and for myself, I usually lean towards focusing more on the intensity of effort, and we use different scales. So we use the RPE scale and the RIR scale. The RPE scale stands for rate of perceived exertion. So on a scale of 1 to 10, you are basically using this scale to quantify your perceived exertion, or how intense you're working or how hard you're working, right? The intensity of it. And then RIR is the same type of scale. It's actually the inverse of RPE, but it stands for reps in reserve. So usually RIR is used when we're talking about lifting weights, right? So reps in the reserve, or how many reps you have left in the tank before you get to failure. Versus RPE, I usually use that more for like endurance type exercise or cardio conditioning. But with most of my clients, I use RIR for everything, just because it's a little bit easier, I think, or I've just found that it's been easier to understand, and it gets a little bit confusing if you go back and forth between the two. So I like the RIR scale versus focusing on like percentages of 1 rep max. Sometimes that can get very confusing, especially if you're not advanced with lifting. So I think intensity-wise, focusing on RIR or RPE is a good place, is a good tool to use. And then the third one is frequency. So this is basically what organizes the volume and intensity within your program. So it's how you spread your training out throughout the week, throughout the month, throughout the year. That would be frequency. Okay, so to address one part of this question about training specific muscle groups a day, so that would be known as like a body part split, or a quote unquote bro split. So it would be like training, one day you're training chest, one day you're training back, one day's quads. So that would be just training one muscle group per day. There's two main issues that I see with this. In general, if you're training only one muscle group per day, the frequency tends to be too low over the course of the week and the month. So that's kind of one downfall. And the second downfall would be because you're hitting just one muscle so hard each day, your volume is probably going to be inherently dropping lower, and soreness is going to be increasing higher. So soreness, or DOMS, delayed onset muscle soreness, same thing as soreness, that will be increasing, especially if you are only training this one muscle group per day. And that's going to lead to overall lower recovery usually. So those are kind of my two main issues with body part splits, or training one muscle group per day, when we think about kind of the longer term. And it's also probably not super beneficial to train this way unless you're using like steroids or anabolics or juicing or whatever you want to call it, at least for the general population, because it just won't be as productive, again, when we're looking at volume, intensity, and frequency over a longer term scale. So the way that I like to program and also train myself is based on looking at movement patterns rather than looking at muscle groups or body parts. So if you focus on movement patterns and hitting the 5 main movement patterns that I'll chat about in a second, you'll be all set with your training because you'll be hitting all the necessary muscle groups on a weekly basis that you need to. So I'll go through these 5 movement patterns. The first one is knee dominant or knee flexion. That's going to be all of your squat variations, any type of squat variation, doesn't matter what it is. Those are going to be mostly knee dominant, knee flexion. So back squats, front squats, split squats, whatever it is. Then also things like leg press and walking lunges. So those are mostly going to be knee dominant or knee flexion movement patterns. It's also important to think about the single or unilateral leg work with this. So those walking lunges, single leg split squats, things like that. Those are important to incorporate into your program as well. And that's something that a lot of people don't think about. So that's super important. And then the second movement pattern would be hip dominant or hip hinge movements. So these are going to be all of your deadlift variations, conventional, sumo, Romanian deadlifts, all those, and then all of your hip thrust variations, any like glute ham raises, reverse lunges, or any glute dominant lunges. So those are all going to fit into that hip dominant or hip hinge movement pattern category. So that's number 2. Number 3 is all of your upper body push movements. And this will come in 2 different planes. So 2 movement planes, which will be horizontal and vertical. So for your horizontal push, those are mostly going to be chest dominant movements. So any bench press variation, any push-up variation, those are going to be horizontal pushing movements. And then you'll have vertical pushing movements. So these are going to be mostly your shoulder dominant and tricep movements. So things like overhead press variations, those would be, if you're thinking about the movement plane, you're pushing overhead, that's going to be vertical, again, versus horizontal, which would be like a bench press, you're pushing out in front of you. So that's a horizontal plane. So horizontal and vertical push are the third movement patterns, or third movement pattern with 2 movement planes within it. And then the fourth one is a pull. So an upper body pull, which does include horizontal and vertical as well. So for the horizontal pull, those would be things like any type of rows, barbell rows, dumbbell rows, any type of row, horizontal pull. That would be the horizontal pull. And then vertical pull would be any type of lat pull down or pull-ups. That would be categorized as a vertical pull. So that's the fourth one, horizontal and vertical pulls. And then fifth would be any type of core or spinal movement. And these would include flexion and anti-movement exercises. So when I say anti-movement, I'm referring to anti-rotation, anti-extension, anti-lateral flexion of your spine. And if you have no idea what I'm talking about, I recorded an entire episode all about training your core. It's actually episode 32. It's called Building an Anti-Fragile Core, The Secret to Sexy and Functional Abs. I will link that in the show notes if you haven't checked it out yet. I go all into basically how to train your core and give you sample exercises for all the different movements that I just mentioned in terms of anti-rotation, anti-extension, anti-lateral flexion, all of those. So if you have no idea what I'm talking about, go check out that episode. I'll link it in the show notes. Okay, so personally, my training splits are usually 4 days a week or 5 days a week of actual lifting. So with 4 days a week, if I'm doing a 4-day per week split, it's usually going to be an upper lower split. So 2 days of upper body, 2 days of lower body. And then if I'm doing 5 days per week, which I'm doing right now because I'm in a gaining phase, I'm pushing my volume, pushing my intensity, trying to build muscle. And not saying that you can't build muscle in a 4-day per week program, but I'm in that category of intermediate, an intermediate lifter, I guess you could say. If you're a novice, intermediate, advanced, I would say I'm more intermediate. So my volume needs to be a little bit higher in order to push myself and push the results I'm getting. So I'm training 5 days per week right now. I'm training a full body push-pull split where it's a little bit more advanced. So it's a push-pull hybrid. And I'm doing full body each day. So each day has an anterior, either has an anterior focus, so quad, shoulders, and chest focus, or a posterior focus, which would be glutes, hams, and back focus. So that's kind of what I'm doing right now. When I'm programming for clients, though, the splits that are most popular for my clients are either a 3-day per week full body split or a 4-day per week upper lower split. So 2 days upper, 2 days lower. Those are the most common because those are the ones that usually fit within the clients that I work with, within their lifestyle, how many days a week they're training, so on and so forth. And lastly, in terms of following a full body program, there are actually a few of the scenarios where I'll probably program a full body program, not just because of the days per week, but because of some other factors. So the first scenario would be if you're within the first year or two of your training or lifting consistently and progressively, a 3-day full body split is going to be a really great place to start. You want to think about this as like a minimal effective dose to see results, right? So there's no need for you to be training 5 or 6 days a week if you're completely new to training, or at least if you're completely new to following a progressive, structured program. You'll get a lot out of the 3 days per week, and you'll see results there. And then as you advance, you're increasing the amount of days you need to train per week will probably become necessary to actually hit the volume levels that you need to progress. So that's what I just mentioned. I'm 5 days per week right now, whereas when I first started training consistently, I was doing 3 or 4 days. So again, that would be the first scenario. The second scenario would be if you're a dual athlete. So I actually have a client right now who is a triathlete, and so she's training for triathlons, but she also wants to get stronger, right? And so she wants to lift weights and follow a progressive program. So I have her following a 3-day per week full body split, because obviously she has a lot of other training outside of strength training. She has to swim, bike, and run, obviously. So that's a good training split for her. She could also probably do 2 days per week, but she's a little bit more advanced. So she wants to do 3 days per week full body. The third scenario would be if you can or want to only train 3 days per week. Again, this kind of goes back to the first thing I mentioned. That's when, thinking back to the realistic part of it and what you personally can follow in the long term for your lifestyle. Not like, oh, I think, for the next 2 weeks, I'll be able to lift 4 days a week, but then, work's going to get busy and something's going to come up and I can only train 2 days per week for the rest of the month or whatever it is. You need to be realistic with yourself so that you can be consistent with your training. Because if you can only train, like if you train 4 days per week for those next 2 weeks, and then you can only train 3 days per week for the 2 weeks after that, and if you're following an upper lower split, then you're going to be, it's going to be a little bit of an issue, right? So I would just say, think about, obviously you can roll over the days into the next week. That's not an issue, but it becomes a little bit more complicated. So again, just think about what's realistic for you in the long term. And then the fourth scenario would be if you've been training for 4+ days per week for a long period of time and you just need a break, or you just have other things going on in life where training might have to take a little bit of a back seat. So that's totally fine. And there's periods that everybody goes through. And again, it just comes back to what your goals are and what works personally for you. So hopefully that answered your question. And gave a little insight into how I train and how I program for my clients. All right, last question today. What are some recovery tips you can share after having drinks and a cheat meal? Okay, so first of all, I want to ask you what your goals are, right? Because this is going to determine, how strict or lenient you can be after a cheat meal, which I don't like referring to them as cheat meals. But yeah, I would say, what is your goals, right? Or what are your goals, right? Are you in a fat loss phase? Are you just maintaining? Are you in a gaining phase? Because this will determine, kind of how flexible you can be with where you're at, right? And also, like, what's your timeline? So for example, if you're in a fat loss phase and you have a specific event in mind to hit a specific goal in terms of your body composition by that timeline, say it's like a wedding or a photo shoot or a birthday or whatever it is, then if you're closer to that event, then it's probably going to be a little bit more, you're probably gonna have to be a little bit more strategic with how you kind of come out of this cheat meal or drink or night of drinks or whatever it is, versus if you were in a maintenance phase or a gaining phase, you're a little bit more lenient, or if you were far out from your, even if you are in a fat loss phase and you're far out from your event, you have a little bit more wiggle room there. So it all comes back to what your goals are, right? And where you're at in the timeline of those goals. So one thing I would say, for example, if you are, in a fat loss phase specifically, what I like to say is that instead of kind of having these, obviously these times are going to happen where you go out and maybe you have like, you eat more than you, plan to, or you drink more than you plan to. But the biggest thing with that, especially, I mean, I would say for any goal that you're in, I would say that the biggest thing is to plan for it, right? Because you don't want it to turn into these cycles where you're going out and binging on the weekend or eating tons of calories on the weekend or drinking tons of things on the weekend. And then afterwards, you're feeling guilty about it. So you start restricting and you're going through these like cycles of overeating and then restricting, overeating and restricting. They're not planned, right? They're just happening. They're not planned. And when I say planned, I'm going to talk about in a second, but this causes issues, right? This causes things with eating disorders, It causes eating disorders, and it causes guilt and negative, a negative relationship with food, right? So that's what we want to avoid. And so when we're talking about planning these things, we have to realize, especially, if you're in a fat loss phase, for example, calories don't reset overnight, right? We look with all my clients, we look at calories on a weekly basis, and we plan ahead to incorporate these types of situations. And one of the biggest things is thinking realistically about your lifestyle, right? If you're someone who generally does eat more on the weekends, then we plan for that, right? We follow a 5-2 split, which would be, eating a little bit less calories during the week when you're when you're working, you're busy, maybe you don't usually eat as much, and then giving you more calories on the weekends because we know those are the times when you tend to eat a little bit more. But it's planned. Like we structure your macros, you structure your calories so that it's a 5-2 split. So it's planned out because we know calories don't reset overnight. So if we can account for that, and this is a strategy called calorie cycling or implementing refeeds, for example, that is a plan and that is a structure. And so if you can implement that, then maybe you can go out on these, you can go out and have a treat meal, or you can consume more calories, you can have a few drinks, but you're fitting it into the overall plan. So that would be something that I would think about as you're kind of thinking about these quote unquote cheat meals or having some more drinks or whatever it is. Just the biggest thing is, plan it in. If you're going to cheat, which I don't like to call it again, plan that first. Plan your meal or plan the event ahead of time. So if you know you have an event on Friday night, or if you know you want to go out with some friends on a Friday night and have a few drinks and probably eat a little bit more, plan ahead of time. Pull like a few hundred calories from the days before that. And maybe the Friday that you're going to go out, maybe you intermittent fast till like 12 o'clock so you can push some more calories towards the end of the night. And then you have a lot to work with in your quote unquote calorie budget, especially if the goal is fat loss or if you're in a fat loss phase. So that's something I think about, because you want to shift your mindset from feeling guilty to turning this into part of the plan. Because if it's part of the plan, then there's no reason to feel guilty about it, right? It's part of the plan. And this is where refeeds and diet breaks and all of those things come into play when we're talking about following a strategic diet protocol or fat loss protocol or whatever it is. Those are when these kind of tools and strategies come into play. And these are all the tools that I implement with my clients. So if you're struggling with this, shameless plug, apply for coaching. It's something that a lot of us need help with. I have my own coach because I struggle with some of these things as well. So I would just say, if this is something that is happening often and you have a goal that you haven't been able to reach, the best thing you can do is create a plan and create structure and set yourself up for success, rather than kind of spinning your wheels and going back and forth between these these yo-yo periods or these like binge restrict. That's not a healthy relationship with food, and that can cause more issues down the line. So Anyway, that is my opinion on that. In terms of recovery tips, though, to go back to your question, I would just say the biggest thing is just get right back on track. Get right back to your, whatever your quote unquote normal eating is. Just get back on track the next day. If you're hungover from alcohol, obviously you want to be getting a lot of water and electrolytes in. So make sure you're super hydrated. Not super hydrated, but you're getting enough water in so that you are hydrated, because we know that alcohol is in itself dehydrating. And also electrolytes, sodium is super important. I personally don't drink much, but one of the meals that was a go-to meal for me when I was in college and was having a few more drinks than usual, or than usual now, was actually scrambled eggs cooked in a little bit of butter with a ton of sea salt. For some reason, that was just like a hangover cure meal for me. Again, I don't drink that much, so I haven't dealt with that in a while, but maybe try that. The next thing I would say is maybe use those extra calories towards a harder training session. So if you did have a bunch of calories the night before, or more, you consume more food and more calories than you planned on, maybe put those to work right the next day. Go to the gym, have a hard training session. Obviously, if you're hungover, it's probably going to be a little bit harder. But I would say if that's the case, then maybe instead of just like laying around on the couch all day, you go out and get a little bit of extra movement in. So just go on a few extra walks throughout the day. Just get moving. That will increase your NEAT, or your non-exercise activity thermogenesis, non-exercise activity thermogenesis, which I talk about a lot, and why that's so important, especially if the goal is fat loss. So I would say, and maintenance too, I would say just think about those things, just little strategies here and there to help with that. But again, it just comes down to having more structure, right? And structuring your weeks around, or having a plan going into the weekend. If you know that that is something that you struggle with, create a plan around that. Create something that allows you to go out and maybe eat some more than you usually do throughout the week, but it's planned into your structure and your plan. I said plan like 5 million times, but it's important to have a plan. Anyway, with that being said, that was the last question of the day. So thank you for listening to this Q&A episode. If you want to view any of the things that I talked about in terms of links, like the book that I referred to in the beginning, The Hungry Brain, or the blog post I referred to, I will link those in the show notes. You can view those in the description, or you can go to my website, MetFlexLife.com, and hit the podcast tab, and all of the show notes will be up there. And besides that, if you enjoyed the episode, as always, please share it out to your friends and family, and help me spread the word about the show. And I will be here next week for another Q&A. All right, talk to you then.